Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and I want to know what got you into Final Fantasy. For me, it goes all the way back to the year 1998, about midway through that year, when I'd reconnected with my cousin and brother from another mother, Tim, after 10 years of not having been on speaking terms with him. We sort of fell out of love with each other, in childhood, and about 10 years later into our teens and everything, we had been reintroduced by my grandparents, I want to say around about 1996, 1997-ish, and we became fast friends all over again. We liked a lot of the same kinds of things, music and video games and movies and such like that, and we just got a kick out of each other all over again, and again we were like brothers, we were like that, and so we had spent time, like he would come and visit on occasion. I could never afford visiting him, so he would come to Florida from up north, and we'd hang out and have fun, stuff like that. And so around about 1998, some odd, he had finally gotten around to getting a PlayStation after having, I think, been introduced to it through one of his friends, somebody I, had no familiarity with at all whatsoever. And I remember talking to him on the phone on occasion, and he would be regaling me with these adventures of this game that he was playing, this brand new game. And, it took me quite a while to even remember what the hell the game was called. It happened to be Final Fantasy VII. And I'd be on the phone with him, and he's like, oh, I'm trying to level up, and, they got me doing this whole mission or side quest, or however he referred to it, still in the early stages of wrapping our minds around what the hell Final Fantasy was. And he would regale me with these stories about, they got me at this chocobo farm, or whatever the hell it's called, and you got to raise them, and you got to get to secret areas on the map and all this stuff. And all of this description was going way over my head. I had no idea what in the hell he was talking about. I still had sort of vivid memories of Duck Hunt and Super Mario Brothers. There wasn't a lot of interplay in between there. I think we might have had a Sega Genesis by then. But, there was like playing X-Men games and Sonic and stuff like that. So Final Fantasy, I didn't know what Final Fantasy was. I'd never heard of it. Never been exposed to it at all whatsoever. And I know, there were several games out way before that on the Super Nintendo and such like that. The original came out on Nintendo, the original NES, and but I'd never heard hide nor hair of any of it. It was completely new to me, and it was just an interesting experience because at that midpoint in 1998, when he finally visited again, he brought his PlayStation and a whole slew of games that he had borrowed as well as bought for himself. And among them was Final Fantasy VII. And I had actually been keeping a logbook, a journal book, at the time, and I had to sort of refresh my memory because I'd been remembering it all wrong for the last, however many years. I've been saying that it happened in 1997, which I think I was confusing with the debuts of the PlayStation, the PS1, as well as Final Fantasy VII, the game. I believe it came out in 1997, but we didn't find it until a year later, or months later. He got me started pretty early on into the game, and I was absolutely captivated by it. It was like a complete new world, a new horizon dawning before me, playing just a little bit of this game, starting off pretty early into it. And at the time I was at probably one of the heights of my pursuing a literary career, and I remember just after the experience of playing this game for a limited amount of time. I mean, there was not enough time to, hold any hope of actually completing it or anything like that, because he was only, spending time with us for a week, that particular week. And when he left, the game and the console and everything went with him. So it would be some time before I would come back around to it. But I was really heavily inspired and came up with one of my chief sort of novel trilogy concepts surrounding some of the things that were going on in that game at the time. And I just remember being completely, it's an experience that if you look at some of the original Tetsuya Nomura character art designs, the sort of paintings and stuff in the booklets and the pamphlets and everything on the game box, if you see any of the promotional material from back in the 90s, a lot of those sketch artwork pieces and everything like that really had a heavy anime influence in the character designs and such as he had designed them. And I can almost point to this as being my first opening my eyes to Japanese animation, to anime, to that style. It would be in the subsequent years, just, part and parcel with that, that I would stumble onto anime on like Cartoon Network and Adult Swim and be really just won over by it, because it reminded me of the experience of just those first few hours playing into Final Fantasy VII. And I remember in the year that followed, my mother had passed away in early 1999, and sort of coinciding with that, one of the ways that I sought sort of trying to lessen the blow of that, because she had spent years ailing and failing health, and we knew it was inevitable. It was something that was coming one way or the other, whether we liked it or not. And one of the ways that I would try to console myself was I would pour myself into video games at that time. I finally managed to sort of finagle the money enough out of my grandparents to allow me to buy my own PlayStation and a small handful of games, a modest amount of games, mostly related to the ones that he had brought, the NBA Live and the bowling game. And I don't think I got Tomb Raider, but I was big into gaming magazines because he was big into them at the time, and this was where we learned about all the new upcoming games. And the big talk, even though Final Fantasy VII had been out for a little while, was Final Fantasy VIII. And I remember we went to like bookstores and things and found Electronic Gaming Monthly, EGM, Game Pro, and other kind of gaming magazines, because we were looking for any info coming out of Japan. Teasers and imagery and character designs. And it was all consuming to me. It had become, in the blink of an eye, a passion. During the week that he had been hanging out with us, when he first introduced me to Final Fantasy VII, again, it had been out for like several months, maybe a year, and we went to I don't remember, I think it was Babbage's in one of our local malls here in Florida at the time, when in the house we lived at the time, and they actually had a box set of Bandai Final Fantasy VII figures. It was Cloud, it was Barrett, it was Tifa, Aerith, and I think you got a chocobo and a frog. This big deluxe box says like $40. And I don't think my cousin quite wrapped his mind around the idea that I was a figure toy collector and everything like that. He sort of saw it as wasted money. But I was adamant. I was not leaving the store without it. It was the only one in the store. If I wasn't going to get it, I was going to regret it. And so I bought it. I still have it to this day. It is put away in one of my closets. But it's the original sort of initial release of figures based around Final Fantasy VII, and I needed it. I couldn't leave the mall without it. And I'd only played a handful of hours of the game, in that week, that span of time that he had introduced me to it. But it had become an all-consuming passion that early on in the release of it. Just, again, months on, and especially as we got into 1999, I don't really know exactly why it was, when I'd finally secured myself my own copy of Final Fantasy VII, I had started a new game again. This was my copy of the game. Obviously, I had to start brand new, fresh. And I kind of just sort of drifted away from it after a little while. I think it was probably largely revolving around my mother's ailments and her life coming to an end the way that it did in early 1999. And so I never actually pursued the playthrough all the way through to the end of Final Fantasy VII. I had not completed it when I was already becoming all sort of consumed with the oncoming Final Fantasy VIII. And as it, the debut of it was looming, I'm almost 100% sure, I want to say I'm about 98% sure that I had pre-ordered it at a local Target. And I don't remember anymore what exactly the complication was, but there was a complication where they didn't get enough of them in to coincide with all the pre-orders or something like that, and it was looking very likely that I wasn't going to be able to get my copy of Final Fantasy VIII when it released. It turned out that some people who had pre-ordered, who were above me on like the waiting list or whatever, had not come in to purchase it. They bought it somewhere else because they got their hands on it quicker, whatever like that. So they had copies of Final Fantasy VIII to spare, from the pre-orders. And I was subsequently able to get my game. I bring it home, And immediately I am crushed because I think it's disc 2 in the box. And this is the days of like 4 discs, 3 and 4 discs for full RPG investment, gameplay. The whole world, you go through so much of the game and then you have to change disc after disc after disc. The second disc, I believe it was the one, whichever one it is that has Renoa Heartily on the Final Fantasy VIII disc, was broken. And I still have the disc to this day. You might be able to see right back here. I still have the broken disc. They let me keep it. Even though I went and I wanted to exchange the crappy box for another one, and they still had spares at that time. I was luckily, just days later, able to replace it out and get my hands on an actual, complete box with no broken discs or anything like that. So really, it's kind of interesting how much akin to like my history with Doctor Who, I wasn't aware of Final Fantasy much as I was unaware of the classic series of Doctor Who. I had vague familiarity with Doctor Who because of childhood memories and things like that, but I had no awareness of classic Final Fantasy, if you will. And Final Fantasy VII was, while it was my first introduction to what Final Fantasy as a franchise was, I did not complete Final Fantasy VII until sometime after I had finally completed Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII was the signature game in the series that I was completely consumed by. I loved all of the characters. I was immersed in the world. I felt really relatable to Squall Leonhardt. While everyone would sort of disparage his being the sort of center hero, the center figure of the game, because of his being sort of distanced from all the other characters and being sort of emo and depressive, a large chunk of what his impetus was, what his driving force was for keeping at arm's length from everyone surrounding him, was because he had a life completely just hellaciously done over with loss. And he had lost a sister as he saw her, and, he constantly had to deal with the idea of losing family and being alone in the world. And this had come just years after the loss of my dad's life and then my mother's life. And so I felt very much a deep connection with Squall. I felt a rapport with him. And in a sense, I escaped the hardships of the real world by pouring myself into playing that game, and I just played the hell out of it. It was a very interesting experience because I had played through all of the first 3 of the 4 discs. When you finally got to the 4th disc, this was like the end game scenario. This is where you're finishing out the game, and I had gotten all the way to the start of disc 4, not having any concept or idea whatsoever of the magic junctioning system that was part of the game system, the combat system in Final Fantasy VIII. I didn't know how to do any of that. I didn't know what that was all about. I thought it was somewhat of an achievement at the time because I got through a vast majority of the game without any sort of, help, without any extra magic or, hyping up the hit points or anything like that. I was bottom of the barrel, steamrolling through this game as best as I could. All the battles were a thorough challenge because I didn't have the magic quotient to power me up, to back me up. And I still managed to get to that 4th and final disc. But then when I got to that disc, I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything. Every single creature and monster that you go up against would instantly kill my characters. And I remember I was like on America Online at the time, and I went to a message board or something, and I was pleading, somebody please explain to me what the hell I'm doing wrong here. And somebody just happened to say, oh, well, what do you have junctioned? And I'm like, junctioned? What are you talking about? What magic? Oh, you can apply magic to your character and it powers them up. It gives them special abilities. I had no idea. I had no idea about any of this. And as soon as I did that, I junctioned all the magic. Next thing I knew, all my characters were pushing the maximum HP, maximum MP, had tons of, different abilities and things like that that were just through the roof. I was enamored by that. I was blown away by that. And beating the game was a virtual cinch. by that point, because I had earned and accrued so much, like power and ability, just strength-wise alone, just battle alone. No magic enhancements, no abilities unlocked, And once I unlocked them all, it was easy peasy Japanese to beat the game. And I remember unlocking, they had limit breaks for all of the characters. And I remember there being some debate because there were optional, in all Final Fantasy games, there are optional bosses. And in Final Fantasy VIII, it's no exception, they had the Ultima weapon and the Omega weapon. If you've ever played Final Fantasy VII, they had Ruby weapon and Emerald weapon, regular weapon, and such like that. A couple of those, Ruby and Emerald specifically, were the optional ones. And but in Final Fantasy VIII, it was Ultima weapon and Omega weapon. Ultima weapon was no slouch, but he was relatively easier to beat than Omega was. And I remember basically formulating this plan directly revolving around the character of Selphie. She had a limit break called The End, which her whole limit break revolved around sort of Vegas-like slots. And you would call it up randomly, and it would choose randomly whatever you would use, whatever ability or power, whatever in battle. But there was one called The End, which, according to what I had read at that point, online, and I had actually taken to collecting lots of the strategy guides because they offered me thick magazine level books of portraiture and characterizations and stories and what you had to do in the game. I never utilized them to play the game, to cheat at the game or anything like that, but I collected them because I wanted to have something whenever I didn't feel like playing the actual game. I could flip through it and look at the pictures and remind myself of the experience of playing it and everything. But I had somewhere along the lines read up on this ability, this limit break ability called The End. And I came up with this idea about trying to summon it in going up against Omega Weapon. Because according to what I had read, it will kill anything and everything, every boss in the game, with one hit. And I'm like, okay, Omega Weapon, with how big of a big bad optional boss he is, how tough he is. I mean, I have seen countless posts after posts after posts, paragraphs after paragraphs of people lamenting how hard it was for them to beat this optional boss. I'm like, I'm going to try this. I'm going to see if I can get him in one hit. And they had a way you could sort of configure bringing about the limit breaks, which usually would only manifest when you had very low hit points. That is to say, near death. They had this item or magic application called Aura, and you would, sort of set it on one of your characters, and this would bring forth the limit break. And I did that with Selphie. As soon as we got into the battle, I put on all of the shielding, magic shielding, attack shielding, everything like that. All the names for which I don't remember because it's been years since I played the games. But I immediately summoned Aura and put it on her and started clicking the button to get her slot's limit break activated. And within the third click, I landed on The End. And I immediately selected it. And all the while, it's only, less than a minute getting into the battle. The battle has just opened up, and it's less than a minute, and she begins summoning forth. The Omega weapon in the battle hadn't done anything yet. It hadn't even blinked to recognize that there were three, characters about to try to pummel its ass and probably have their asses handed to them. And The End summons forth, and I immediately beat Omega weapon in less than 2 minutes, in just one shot, a one-shot kill. And I got the little blurb, the little message award, achievement unlocked back in the day, whatever it was, saying that I had defeated Omega Weapon. And I went online, not to brag in any way, but I'm like, giving alternate suggestions to people who spent all this laborious time whittling away at this, optional boss and everything like that. I'm like, well, this is how I did it. And it worked, and I had a lot of people giving me crap, like hating on me because, oh, that wasn't real. That's not a real achievement. I got the blurb. I successfully killed the thing. Just because I did it in an easier, different way than you did, it doesn't mean it's any less valid, that kind of thing. And, but I completed Final Fantasy VIII before I would then round back to Final Fantasy VII and give that a thorough playthrough. I think I even started a new game again because it had been so long since I had played any Final Fantasy VII at that point. And I wanted a brand new experience from the word go. You know, I wanted to be able to pick up on everything, all the intricacies of the story, much as I had Final Fantasy VIII. And at that point, it was you know, sort of the renaissance of Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy IX was soon to come out. And again, I was pouring through the Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine, EGM, you know, looking at teasers for that, for subsequently Final Fantasy X. And I remember I still have a lot of the old, you know, magazine articles and stuff. I would do what I refer to as gutting the magazines. I would basically tear them apart and just keep the pages about the articles that I wanted to keep, you know, and be able to remember and always point back to, especially in the early going of my passion for Final Fantasy when 9 was coming out. I remember having seen sort of an early sketch of the character of Vivi, the mage from Final Fantasy IX, looking somewhat Orko-esque, if you know, you've ever been a fan of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And that kind of made me laugh. And then I was reading up on the history at that point of the gaming franchise and realized, oh, black mages, that's how they looked in the old games, in the 16-bit and everything like that. This was sort of a, you know, CG, 3D, polygonal version of that with the character Vivi. And I was smitten with Final Fantasy IX. I still felt like 8 and 7 were better, but I was smitten with the old school sort of classical style. You know, magical crystals and things like that were part of the plot and the story of Final Fantasy IX. And with 10, I remember, you know, flipping through a magazine, and one of the earliest shots from some game expo or something like that, before 10 was, you know, like years off from coming out, one of the very earliest screen captures, the character of Titus, or Titus, depending on, you know, your particular want for the pronunciation of his name, it did not look like him. There was a screen capture of the game, and the hair was not in any way like what his hair would eventually become. You know, and I remember being somewhat like weirded out by that when I started to see more official production, you know, photography and imagery and posters and things like that, and building up to Final Fantasy X's subsequent release. And I pulled out that old magazine. I'm like, wow, he looked nothing like that in the early going. They really switched up his character model and stuff. But I loved it. I absolutely fell in love with Final Fantasy X just as well. And would eventually go on to play Final Fantasy X-2. And I played all through Final Fantasy XII. I never played any of the MMO versions of Final Fantasy, you know, which Final Fantasy XI was one of them. And the last sort of stage of my history with Final Fantasy, apart from the films, which I loved, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, which I have the movie poster for right here, as well as Advent Children, which I had, while I had a PlayStation 3, a PS3, which had a Blu-ray player, I still have both Advent Children and The Spirits Within on Blu-ray. Advent Children Complete is the Blu-ray version, which is somewhat different to the standard DVD release, which I have both of. But I can't play the Blu-rays anymore because my PS3 at the time, which died around 2010-ish, and I've never been able to replace. I've never gotten a Blu-ray player or anything like that since. But I've kept the games and the DVDs that I had for PS3 and the Blu-rays in the hopes that one day I will be able to revisit them. But, you know, my last sort of proper having anything to do with concurrent Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy 13, around about 2009, 2010-ish. I had gotten about halfway through that game before my PlayStation 3 at the time became victim to the Y-Law, the Yellow Light of Death. The internal mechanism, something became amiss, and I couldn't play anything else anymore on it. Because of the internal memory core and everything like that, it did not operate on memory cards. Basically, they were telling me if I tried to transfer the CPU or something like that to a new one, you know, I'd lose everything that I had. Playing Ghostbusters, the video game, and, you know, Final Fantasy 13 halfway through that, and having played Mirror's Edge, and, you know, Grand Theft Auto 4, and Metal Gear Solid 4, all these games, all this, you know, accomplishment gone for all intents and purposes. Now, I still have the PlayStation 3 somewhere. buried somewhere, and it still has the original CPU and memory core and everything like that. It's never been tampered with, never been messed with. Maybe someday I might be able to configure some way to bring it back. I don't know. But I effectively, Final Fantasy 13, getting about halfway through that game was the last point, the tipping point for me of being able to play anything modern or current Final Fantasy related. And it was a thorough bum out. You know, I really wanted to complete the game. I had heard people saying the game wasn't that good. It only gets good around the point where, you know, it had cut off for me. But I was enjoying it. I've enjoyed every, you know, version of Final Fantasy that I've played, even 12, which was another game that was somewhat bashed. And again, it became all-consuming to me. It influenced my broadening and opening myself to Japanese animation, to anime. It made me that much more a fan of sort of the renaissance of early console gaming and getting into video games and things like that. Emotionally, it was impactful with the depth of characterization and the story and the hours you would put into these games, 90 plus hours, 80 plus hours, and all that you could accomplish and succeed at and everything like that. And especially at the time where I would go back and forth talking about it with my cousin, my brother from another mother, you know, when Final Fantasy VIII came out, he had gotten his copy a little bit after I had gotten mine, and he's like, he calls me up one day, he's like, all right, I finally got it. Stop where you are in the game. Wait till I catch up with you, and then we're going to play the game together. We'll talk back and forth like we'll be playing it on the phone, and we'll experience it together, because, you know, he had burgeoned me to that world of Final Fantasy with those first few hours of Final Fantasy VII. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys, as I say at this point in the video. What got you into Final Fantasy? If indeed you ever got into the game franchise, what's your favorite game? Who are your favorite characters? What brought it to your awareness? What really sampled it out for you and drew you in? I remember playing a Final Fantasy VIII demo on, I don't remember what game it came with, or if it was a disc that came in a magazine, like PlayStation Magazine or something like that. But I remember playing the early initial demo of Final Fantasy VIII, and you summon forth, you know, like I think Shiva or something like that, or Leviathan. You know, it's a very early going mission in the game. And already I was head over heels. This was the most amazing thing I'd ever laid my eyes on, and that had come after playing Final Fantasy VII, which was my first debut. So it was like a whole new world, a la Aladdin for me, my eyes being open to something new and wondrous and amazing. And I'd love to hear your story along those lines as well. So otherwise, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.